It wasn't the pulpit, the fame, or even the scandals that nearly took T.D. Jakes out. It was life itself. At 67, the bishop who millions call God's chosen voice finally admitted there were moments when his breath almost stopped, when faith felt distant, and when even he questioned if he'd survive another day. But these weren't random scares. Each one carried a secret that shaped the man behind the sermons. And tonight, for the first time, he's revealing the 5 moments he came dangerously close to losing everything, including his life. Behind the lights, cameras, and thunderous applause of packed arenas, few truly know the weight Bishop T.D. Jakes has carried. To the public, he's the powerful voice behind "Woman, Thou Art Loosed," a man who transformed pain into purpose and built an empire of faith, film, and influence. But behind the microphone was a man quietly battling exhaustion, betrayal, and health scares that almost silenced that voice forever. For decades, Jakes stood as the picture of strength, an unshakable leader guiding millions through storms. Yet, what few realize is that his own storms were darker and more dangerous than anyone imagined. These weren't just emotional breakdowns or burnout. They were moments when his heart, his body, and even his faith reached their breaking point. In this story, we're diving deep into the 5 moments that nearly ended the life and legacy of T.D. Jakes. You'll hear about the hidden battles he never wanted the world to see, the haunting nights that forced him to question his calling, and the shocking truth about how close he came to giving up entirely. You won't believe how one incident in particular, something that happened just before one of his biggest sermons, changed the way he looked at God, his family, and his purpose forever. But to understand these moments, we have to go back. Before the conferences, before the books, before the world knew his name, to the man who was once just trying to survive. And what you're about to hear might just change how you see T.D. Jakes forever. When people think of T.D. Jakes, they think of overflowing arenas, best-selling books, and a commanding presence that moves millions to tears. But what most don't realize is that the very success that made him a household name once nearly ended his life. In the early 2000s, when his ministry had exploded beyond anyone's imagination, Jakes found himself trapped in a relentless cycle of preaching, traveling, and leading, all while carrying the emotional weight of thousands who came to him for healing. The spotlight was blinding, the pressure was unending, and his body was quietly breaking down under it all. He would later admit that during those years he barely slept. He ate whatever he could find between flights and often went days without rest. The ministry demanded everything, and he gave it: his time, his voice, his energy, his peace. But what he didn't realize was that he was giving away his health too. There was one night, a night his close friends still talk about in hushed tones, when Jakes collapsed backstage just moments before he was supposed to walk out and preach to a crowd of thousands. He had ignored the warning signs, the chest pain, the dizziness, the fatigue. But that night, his body forced him to stop. He was rushed to a hospital, his heart under immense stress, and for the first time he faced the terrifying question: what if this is it? Doctors told him plainly, if he didn't slow down, he wouldn't make it to see the next decade. For a man used to saving others, hearing that he needed saving shook him to his core. He later confessed in an interview that he realized he had become addicted to movement, to doing more, achieving more, helping more, without realizing that God never asked him to destroy himself in the process. In that hospital bed, hooked up to machines, Jakes had what he would later call a divine confrontation. He realized that even men of faith can lose themselves in the noise of purpose. It was in that moment of stillness, surrounded by silence, machines beeping softly in the dark, that he heard the voice of conviction. You can't pour from an empty vessel. He took that message to heart. But this was just the beginning. What he didn't know was that the physical collapse was only one kind of near-death. The next one would hit him even harder, not in his body, but in his soul. Because what happened next wasn't something he could heal with medicine or rest. If the first moment nearly took his body, this one almost destroyed his soul. Because sometimes the pain that kills you isn't physical, it's betrayal. For years, T.D. Jakes had carried his ministry like a torch in the dark. He poured his heart into people, trusted his inner circle, and believed that loyalty meant safety. But what he didn't see coming was how close the knife would be, and how deep it would cut. It started quietly, whispers behind closed doors, misunderstandings that grew into rumors. People he once prayed with, laughed with, and shared his deepest visions with began turning those same stories into weapons. The higher he climbed, the more they wanted to see him fall. For someone like Jakes, who had spent his entire life preaching about love, forgiveness, and faithfulness, the realization that some of his own were plotting against him was devastating. He once said in a sermon, "I can handle my enemies. It's the betrayal of those who call you brother that breaks you." And that's exactly what happened. The betrayal hit him during one of the most successful seasons of his career. His conferences were selling out. His name was on national television, and yet behind that success, his heart was crumbling. He couldn't understand how people who had seen his tears could turn around and paint him as a fraud, a manipulator, or worse. One night, Jakes reportedly sat alone in his study, long after midnight, surrounded by sermon notes he no longer had the strength to preach. His Bible lay open, but the words blurred through his tears. He whispered a question he had never dared to speak before. "God, why would you let the people I helped hurt me the most?" That night, he said later, was one of the darkest of his entire ministry. Not because of the lies being told, but because he felt something inside him die. The innocence of believing that faith shields you from betrayal vanished. He was forced to confront the truth that even chosen men bleed. The emotional toll began to show. His health declined again. His sermons carried a weight, a sadness that only those who had been broken could recognize. But through it all, he refused to retaliate. Instead, he transformed the pain into wisdom. He turned his heartbreak into one of his most powerful teachings. God will use betrayal to reveal who's really with you, not against you. Still, the scars didn't fade easily. Friends disappeared. Confidence wavered. And for a moment, even Bishop Jakes, the man who taught millions to stand firm in faith, thought about walking away from it all. He told a close friend years later, "That was the moment I almost gave up preaching. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want to be heard. I just wanted to heal." But something remarkable happened next. A quiet moment of strength that no one saw coming. It was during a Sunday service after weeks of absence when he stepped back onto the stage. The audience rose in applause, but he didn't smile. He stood there, silent, letting the room settle. Then he said one line that sent chills through the crowd. "They tried to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed." That line became one of his most quoted moments, a declaration of resilience that reignited his purpose. The betrayal that almost killed him became the moment that rebirthed him. Yet, even after overcoming the heartbreak, T.D. Jakes didn't realize that another storm was waiting. One that wouldn't come from people or pressure, but from deep within his own body. A health scare that nearly ended everything for good. After surviving the betrayal that broke his spirit, Bishop T.D. Jakes thought he had already faced the worst. But life wasn't done testing him. Because sometimes, the true battle comes not from what happens around you, but what's happening inside of you. The battles no one can see, not even the ones closest to you. It was during a time when everything seemed to be going right again. The ministry was thriving, his family was strong, and his influence had reached levels even he hadn't imagined. But late one night, after a powerful conference where he preached with thunderous conviction, something felt wrong. His voice, the instrument that carried the word to millions, began to fail him. At first, it was just hoarseness, something he brushed off as exhaustion. But the next morning, it was worse. By the end of that week, he could barely speak above a whisper. For a man whose calling depended on his voice, it was as if his identity was being stripped away. Doctors told him it could be a serious vocal cord condition, one that, if untreated, might end his preaching career entirely. The weight of those words crushed him. Imagine being told that the very thing God used to define your life could be taken from you forever. During that period, Jakes withdrew from public appearances. Weeks went by without him stepping on stage. He later shared that it was one of the loneliest times of his life. He wasn't just fighting a medical issue. He was wrestling with fear. The fear that his purpose had an expiration date. In that quiet season, he began to realize how fragile even divine assignments can feel. The same voice that had roared through arenas was now a faint whisper echoing in empty rooms. But instead of letting despair consume him, Jakes used that silence to listen. Not to the crowd, not to the critics, but to God. He described that season as a spiritual surgery. While his body healed, his soul underwent a transformation. He began journaling, reflecting, and recentering his priorities. For the first time in years, he wasn't preaching. He was listening. And it was in that silence that he found strength again. After months of rest and treatment, his voice began to return. Not the same as before, but deeper, wiser, and more powerful. When he finally stood behind the pulpit again, there was something different about him. The crowd could feel it. He spoke slower, with purpose, with gratitude. The storm had changed him. And just when it seemed the worst was behind him, another kind of near-death experience came his way. One that tested not his health or his trust in people, but his very faith in God's plan. Every believer, no matter how strong, eventually faces a moment when faith feels like a fading flame. For T.D. Jakes, that moment came during a season of overwhelming loss and emptiness. It wasn't a single event. It was a slow, painful unraveling of everything he thought he understood about life and purpose. He spoke once about waking up one morning and feeling nothing. No motivation, no fire, no passion. He said it was as if the anointing that had guided him all those years had quietly left the room. He tried to preach through it, pray through it, and even hide it behind smiles. But every time he stood on stage, something inside whispered, "You're done." This internal darkness lasted months. During that time, Jakes pulled away from nearly everyone. He spent long hours in solitude, journaling, crying, and confronting old wounds he'd buried beneath decades of ministry. He later revealed that what saved him wasn't another sermon or miracle. It was humility. The realization that even the strongest shepherds need rest. He began to see that near-death moments don't always come with sirens and doctors. Sometimes they come quietly, as spiritual exhaustion, when your soul is too tired to keep believing. Out of that darkness came one of his most powerful messages ever. God doesn't need you to be strong all the time. Sometimes, He just needs you to be still. That was the turning point. It was the resurrection of his faith. Not through power, but through surrender. It happened unexpectedly, and it reminded him that death doesn't send invitations. Reports say that several years ago, during one of his travels, Bishop Jakes was involved in a serious car accident. Though the details were kept private, insiders close to the family said the crash could have ended far worse. In that moment, trapped inside a twisted vehicle, unsure if he'd make it out, Jakes said he saw his life flash before his eyes. Not the fame, not the money, just faces, his wife, his children, his congregation. He realized how fragile everything truly was. When he walked away from that wreckage, shaken but alive, he knew it was no coincidence. It was grace. Pure grace. And it became the final reminder that no matter how powerful, how successful, or how faithful you are, life is still a gift. That near-death moment reshaped his outlook. He began prioritizing health, family, and balance more than ever before. His sermons softened. His tone changed. There was a new humility in his words, the kind that only comes from standing face to face with death and choosing to live again.